let's hold them till the end.
Okay, and I think that everyone can hear us, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. Dr. Amy Krings is an associate professor of social work at Loyola University Chicago. Her research focuses on how marginalized groups strategically and collectively advance social and environmental justice. She is a leader of the Grand Challenge Advisory Council on Social Responses to a Changing Environment and a board member of Influencing Social Policy and the Association of Community Organization and Social Change. So thank you, Dr. Krings, for being with us today.
Thank you. My pleasure. So my understanding of what I'm going to do today is talk a little bit about environmental justice as a topic that social workers need to care about. And so there might be some folks in the audience that are thinking about this topic for the first time today. There might also be folks that have thought about environmental justice quite a bit, but haven't thought about it in the context of their social work practice. And then there might be folks that are knee-deep in these issues. So for that reason, I'm going to go ahead and give some, start with some terms and some context first, and then we'll open it to questions, okay? So I'm going to share my screen.
And Dr. Krings, your audio is just a little bit crackly.
Okay. Is that any better?
It's louder, but try talking a little bit more.
Try what? Talking a little more?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm not sure I can do much about that. I'm
okay.
In my office, and the internet is usually pretty good here. So
okay.
I'm sorry for that. I'm not sure that there's something to be done.
Okay. But it is okay? Louder with that out. Yeah. But either way is fine, I think.
Okay. Why don't I leave them out then? Okay. So I'm going to share a screen. Okay, so the title of my talk today is Why Social Work Advocacy is Needed to Promote Environmental Justice. So in the talk, first I'll talk about briefly what is environmental justice, why it's important to social work. Then there were a couple of questions about my career trajectory and how I came to integrate community organizing, environmental justice, and social change. And then last, I'll talk about what an eco-social work advocacy and political action might include. Like I said, it'll probably be about 20 minutes. So, okay, research on social and health impacts of pollution and toxic waste concludes that the poor and people of color bear a disproportionate burden of environmental hazards. They are more likely to be exposed to pollution, toxic waste, and other forms of contamination. They are less likely to have access to environmental amenities, such as parks and green spaces. This matters because environmental degradation culminates in environmental health impacts, including mental health and physical health disparities. These map onto and exacerbate racial and economic disparities. These phenomena are often termed environmental racism. Social workers, who are traditionally concerned with the promotion of human rights and social justice, are primed to be strong partners in environmental justice movements. Yet the profession largely lacks a presence in environmental practice, research, and policymaking. To begin to understand and address environmental injustice and environmental racism, we must understand their root causes. Environmental racism arises from economic inequality, structural racism, limited enforcement of environmental and public health regulations, and land use decision-making processes that exclude vulnerable and impacted groups. Environmental justices are thus neither natural nor inevitable. They result from power inequalities and require political solutions. For instance, in most parts of the world, the social groups that consume the most natural resources and create the most waste and pollution are the least likely to have to live or work near facilities that produce or manage waste and contamination. Perhaps the most obvious visible manifestation of environmental injustice can be found within sacrifice zones, a term used to describe frontline communities where the health and well-being of the land and its residents are devalued and sacrificed for the benefit of the broader community. Much of my research takes place with people living or working in sacrifice zones. For example, I took this picture while conducting ethnographic research as part of my dissertation. It depicts two occupied homes in close proximity to a steel mill in the multicultural, multilingual Southwest Detroit neighborhood of Delray. Residents of Delray experience some of the highest asthma rates in the state, in part because of their proximity to heavy industry and heavy transportation, such as interstates and an international border crossing. So environmental racism and environmental injustice are what residents, community organizations, and social movements are fighting against. What is it that they are fighting for? Simply put, environmental justice is the philosophy that all people in all communities are entitled to equal protection under environmental and public health regulations. As social work grapples about how to engage with climate change, urban development, and environmental racism, I argue that environmental justice theory and practice is a useful approach because it attends to distributive justice, meaning the fair distribution of environmental burdens and amenities, procedural justice, meaning inclusive decision-making processes that center people impacted by environmental injustice, and the justice of recognition, meaning centering the voices and priorities of marginalized groups, including people of color and immigrants, who are most impacted by environmental contamination. The goal of my research agenda then is to develop innovative, impactful, community-based, and transdisciplinary environmental justice research. My research reveals opportunities for social workers to support health equity while working to address the root causes of environmental justice, a practice known as eco-social work. Okay, so there were some questions about how I came to this topic. My research agenda and approach to teaching are grounded in my practice experience as a community organizer and nonprofit manager. I completed my MSW at the University of Michigan in their community organization concentration as part of their Southwest Detroit community-based initiative. Following my MSW program, I returned to my hometown of Cincinnati, Ohio, where I worked for an organization that sought to advance racial justice in the city, focusing on reforming policing practices. For 6 years, I was in deep relationship with people and communities who were experimenting with innovative and yet very difficult work oriented toward racial justice, equity, and inclusion. This included the implementation of a public health approach to crime prevention rooted in the Chicago ceasefire model. During those 6 years, my colleagues and I wrestled with dilemmas and tensions at the core of community practice, like how to transform organizations that are resistant to change, how to build solidarity across difference, how to shift understandings of the root causes of social problems from individually based behavioral issues to historically grounded and structurally based social problems, and how does one measure and prove the impact of community-based interventions? That last question became an increasingly important one for me because it was difficult to locate empirical research about the outcomes of community-driven campaigns despite funders' desires for evidence-based practice. Consequently, I was under-resourced as a grant writer, not to mention precariously employed. At that time, I was adjunct teaching courses for my alma mater, Xavier University, which I enjoyed. After teaching courses in BSW level macro social work, I was invited to design and teach an interdisciplinary course on community organizing. I was energized by my students in this work. This combination of 1, a need for research on community change, coupled with 2, a love of teaching, led me to return to the University of Michigan to pursue my doctorate in social work and political science. My dissertation research emerged from a 4-year political, ethnographic, and interview-based study in which I traced a community-based campaign to secure economic and environmental protections in Southwest Detroit. As previously mentioned, Delray residents already suffered from serious environmental health impacts. Therefore, when the neighborhood was identified as the proposed site to build a second international bridge and border crossing, residents were justifiably worried about more pollution due to trucks and their diesel emissions. Having said that, they welcomed the potential of new jobs and investments. Thus, rather than organizing to prevent the construction of the new bridge crossing, they organized to pursue a community benefits agreement. Community benefits agreements have been used by communities in the U.S. to secure local accountability and investment in schools, housing, and green spaces in exchange for hosting new developments. They can be a tool to ensure that economic development projects benefit local residents and workers. I immersed myself within the Southwest Detroit Community Benefits Coalition, studying their goal setting, strategic decisions, tactics, and power dynamics at local, city, state, federal, and even international levels. Importantly, my dissertation also set a foundation for me. Before I describe the research that followed the dissertation, I want to highlight 3 themes that I think you'll notice. Community engagement, in that my work centers the people and community who are most impacted by environmental racism. My work is transdisciplinary in that I integrate theory and empirical work from disciplines including sociology, urban studies, and environmental studies. And it's multiscalar in that it includes both structural and community level analysis. My work is solution focused. While it's important to understand the causes and consequences of environmental racism, I focus on what is to be done. Briefly, I'll tell you about one of the studies I did that was based in Flint, Michigan, which examined the Flint water crisis, including its causes, consequences, and citizens' efforts to mitigate harm associated with it. Because of my engagement in Detroit, I was already familiar with the state of Michigan's political system that contributed to the water crisis, known as emergency management. Emergency management is a state-level policy that intends to address fiscal emergencies in urban areas by shifting decision-making authority from elected bodies to an appointed city manager whose role is to cut public spending. My research demonstrates why this policy disproportionately and negatively impacts Black and Latine residents by limiting their political influence and their access to public goods and services. With that political context in mind, I explored how residents of Flint, Michigan organized to secure clean water and to challenge the austerity-driven policies that created the water crisis. The study relied on an analysis of local journalism as well as interviews and participant observation. It found that the people of Flint, like many impacted by austerity political measures, were not deemed credible by officials nor reporters when they described their health concerns, in part because of systematic racism and classism. It revealed multiple points in which decisions were made in the name of fiscal austerity that resulted in public health crises. Yet residents and grassroots community organizations were able to prevent a crisis that could have been much larger in scope if not for local pressure. And they certainly revealed opportunities for social work to be more engaged. Briefly, I can mention I did another study that looked at the state of environmental social work and found that of the publications that we have that integrate both the environment and social work, 35% are about natural disasters or environmental crises. So to my mind, that is very important for social work practitioners to be familiar with that research. but also to bear in mind that there are some important opportunities, such as going beyond reactive approaches to climate change to include proactive interventions, going beyond individually based approaches to include collective ones, and going beyond calls that we need to integrate the environment into social work, to examining how we might do so. The last set of studies that I want to share explored the intersections of environmental justice, affordable housing, and gentrification. They asked what followed were a series of research projects motivated by a contradiction that sometimes when environmental justice organizing is successful, it can contribute to gentrification. And so we asked the question, how might environmental justice organizations promote environmental justice, reducing exposure to environmental hazards, or securing environmental amenities in a way that does not contribute to gentrification? So hopefully we can talk a little bit more about that in the question and answer section. That included a study of an environmental justice organization that is based in a gentrifying Mexican American community, where I examined tensions relating to recruitment and agenda setting within the organization and offered anti-racist practice principles to prevent the creation of gentrifying organizations. So last, what might an eco-social work list look like? Social work students and practitioners have the potential to influence social welfare policies directly. They can also support service users and community groups in building political power and influence. So here I want to highlight that it's important for social workers to pay attention to both fair processes as well as outcomes. Social workers can help increase political power and influence of marginalized residents and communities. They are needed to develop and implement inclusive decision-making processes that attend to power imbalances between residents, their allies, and policymakers. So specifically what this can look like is listening to and supporting groups that are already doing environmental justice advocacy, recruiting, training, and supporting residents who might not otherwise have the skills or confidence to engage in advocacy work, assisting groups in developing ongoing relationships with academic partners, and using an intersectional approach rather than a siloed approach. So when I say that, one example would be integrating housing rather than just looking at the natural environment. And then in addition to having fair processes, which social workers can be especially good at, we want to pay attention to fair outcomes. So some examples of what that might look like are advocating for policies such as those relating to zoning and permitting to better protect people from environmental racism, or at a federal level, because local concerns are often shaped by global economic and political systems, it's necessary to advocate for reforms that address environmental, racial, and economic injustices, especially those that we want to make sure that we have policies that prioritize people's health over corporate profit, or that shift to a green, sustainable economy. And we want to look for social norms that are sometimes codified in policy so that we can counter classist and racially biased beliefs that are embedded in conceptions of expertise and authority. This can include the development of institutions that are accountable to residents, providing information in a transparent and timely way. And then last, we want to make sure we're using a holistic approach. So that's it for my presentation. Again, I just wanted to provide some terms and some background, because some of this is new to some folks. And so with that, I think I can wrap up or take questions.
Okay, thank you. We don't have any questions yet, but Leo Davis says hi.
Oh, hi,
former
Leo.
Student of yours.
Okay, how are you doing, Leo? Ask me a question, Leo. Where, by the way, are the questions appearing? Because for me, I don't see them.
Yeah, so since I have them in the chat, and so I think since you entered in a different way, maybe you can't see them, but okay. Nothing has been posted yet. But we do have a possible interaction. If I want to give everybody like one more minute to see if they have any questions. I have a few questions that I can ask if no one else does. So how about what are the most common tasks or responsibilities that you perform in your advocacy work?
Well, so my positionality, I'm an associate professor. So for me, that means that I'm partnering with groups that are doing direct advocacy work. And so some of what I think I shared was trying to shed light on like, what causes environmental injustice, as well as what the consequences are and what people are doing. And then I'm trying to build out an approach for social workers to be involved in anti-racist and anti-oppressive ways so that we're not displacing people who are already doing this work, but rather working in solidarity and alliance with people doing this work. So that's how I see my tasks are oriented around research, developing methods, and teaching.
Okay. We do have a question. How do you continue your advocacy work if and when you get pushback from the profession?
I can't say these days I don't have so much pushback. It's more that it's just marginalized or forgotten about. It's not active resistance. I would say is uncommon for me to hear someone outright say social work should not be concerned about the environment. I think maybe even 5 years ago, people might have thought that, but the degree of climate change and awareness around how impactful it is, especially for people who are poor and marginalized, has shifted that understanding. So for me, in my opinion, at least where I sit in Chicago, there's an appreciation for the environment. But I think where it's not exactly active pushback, it's more passive, is that it can be an afterthought, or maybe people feel overwhelmed and aren't sure what to do. So some things that have changed even within the last 5 years is there are international social work organizations that have listed the environment and climate change as one of the profession's top 4 priorities. Environmental justice has been added to the US for our code of ethics. It's something that we as social workers need to attend to. There's more and more grants and funding available to do this sort of work. But the problem is we don't necessarily have a corresponding knowledge base or set of principles on how to do it. So I think I would say that for me, the why has been made clear. The question now is how. And I think that's where there can be pushback because not everyone would agree that a green economy is the way to go. There are people that profit from like the oil industry, for example. I can give the example that I was at one of the big social work research conferences in January, and 2 students who are in Oklahoma told me that they would receive pushback if they worked to reduce carbon emissions, and especially if they challenged the oil industry. They talked about how the oil industry funds so much of their university, including within the law school. There's even a center for the rights of oil. So part of what I want to say is like I recognize that every state there's a different political and social context. So for me in Chicago, it's not hard for me to make the claim that we need to have alternative sources of energy. We need to have more sustainable jobs. Like in general, that's not a politically risky thing for me to say, but I understand that in a place such as Oklahoma or maybe Texas, that would be very difficult to say. So I think part of it is being very clear and doing a power analysis around your specific context in how to move forward, whether that's at the federal, state, or local level. And that's why I tried to give some examples of what that might look like.
Okay, thank you. So Nicole has the question that's expanding on what you just said. She's a Ph.D. student about to start her dissertation, and she's interested in community-based research, particularly around nature access. And she strongly wants her work to have real community benefit and lead to policy change. How do you combat empathy or lack of appreciation with academia, and specifically social work academia, for this more on-the-ground work? And do you have any advice on how you personally continue your research?
Yeah, thanks for that question, Nicole. Well, there's a few things that I think I'm hearing embedded in that question. So one again is this idea of like, so historically, social workers say on day one in BSW programs that we care about person and the environment, right? And typically what that has meant is the social environment. So part of what I think my work and other environmental social workers are trying to do is remind people that when we say environment, you have to include the natural environment and the built environment, because it's so consequential to people's health and mental health and well-being. And there is not equal access to green spaces, nor is there equal protection from environmental hazards and toxins. So, Nicole, depending upon your context, I think when you start pointing to the natural environment and its relationship to health and mental health, what social workers tend to understand, I have found that to be a good hook. I would also say that sometimes in the United States, we're a little bit behind thinking about the role of the environment. And so I'm familiar with collaborators in Europe, and specifically I have some collaborators in Finland who are working much more in-depthly and have for a longer time been looking at questions of nature and the environment. And you're welcome to reach out to me for sources that might be useful to you. But then another part of what I think I heard your question to be was that you wanted your work to be community-based and community-driven. And so depending upon your doctoral program and what sort of work you want to do when you graduate, there's pros and cons to doing community-based work. For me, it's part of my mission. Like it's something I wouldn't want to compromise on, but I also understand that it can slow things down. Like it is slower to conduct your own interviews and build relationships than it is to have a secondary data set that you analyze and run the numbers. Now, for me, that trade-off is worth it because my whole reason to go to doctoral school and to get a job was that I wanted to work in community. So that's a trade-off that the cost benefit meant that it made more sense for me to work in community. But on the other hand, it meant that I didn't have the same degree of research productivity on paper that some of my peers did. So, that matters depending upon where you want to land. For me, I don't get pushback on doing community engaged work. In fact, I think that is rewarded with a pat on the back. The problem is that because it is slower and because we live in a neoliberal world that values counting and productivity, the trade-off is that if you're slower on paper, you don't look as competitive all the time as someone who has 10 publications and you have 2. So you have to do work of explaining how your work has impact beyond the count. I have a feeling that a lot of the people on this call might be MSW students, so I don't want to go deeper into the weeds than that. But if that's something you want to reach out and talk about more, I mentor doctoral students pretty regularly and can do that.
She threw out a side note that it looks like her advisor, Elizabeth Bowen, who you interviewed once for a podcast.
At University of Buffalo, yeah. So hello, Nicole. Hello, to Betsy Bowen.
All right, so then Leo came up with the question, and he's asked, how can we move from academic theory to direct actionable steps to move policy response forward?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, again, we want to think there's a lot of nuance in terms of how somebody answers that question. So I think I tried to give an example that when it comes to environmental topics, you can think about important policy change that makes a real difference in people's lives at local levels, at state levels, and at federal levels. And depending upon how you think about that, the answer is going to be different. So at a local level, again, depending upon your political context, it can be easier to be in relationship with other people who are already doing this work. And then you literally ask them, you can say, I really value what you're doing. How might I bring resources from Loyola or from your institution to support and build upon and amplify the work that you're already doing? So something I've mentioned before, and I want to say again, is I'm really sensitive about what I don't want to do is have this topic that environmental justice organizers and Indigenous people have been working on for a very long time, and suddenly social workers get excited about it and displace or water down or somehow step in front of people who have knowledge and have been doing this work. I think a much more appropriate strategy is to identify people doing the work, ask them what they need, and bring resources that we have that can be of service. So for me, that's one of the more tangible ways to shift from theory to practice, is actually talk to people and listen to their answers and then try to figure out how to follow through. And then beyond that, I mean, I tend to think that social change doesn't happen at an individual level. I think that it happens collectively. So I think that that means we have to organize. And again, what that can mean is being in relationship with people in events like this one, or through the NASW, or through your student groups, and building more power in that way so as to have influence. So, I mean, those are some really initial steps. And again, it's hard to really answer because there are people calling from all over the US with very different contexts. So those would be some initial examples.
Very good, thank you. In your presentation, you said something about housing. You're hoping we could circle back to that. Is that something you want to do now?
Well, sure. I mean, so, and this actually speaks, I think, to Nicole's question, something to hold in mind carefully is the potential of unintended consequences. So we know that there's not equal access to green space and parks, and we know that there's disproportionate burdens when it comes to contamination and pollution. So those are things that need to be addressed, period. The danger, though, is that in some cases, not in every case, but in some cases, when we clean up contaminated land, or when we build a brand new bike trail or park, that can inadvertently and sometimes intentionally catalyze gentrification. And so the danger there is that if your intention is to improve environmental justice and reduce environmental racism, and then you build a new bike trail in a Black or Latino community, and all the Black and Latino folks get pushed out and affluent white folks move in, then you've effectively reproduced environmental injustice, right? You may have improved the natural environment, but ultimately you've caused harm in ways that you might not have anticipated. So it's really important to use some of that community-based knowledge that you're talking about and to have an intersectional view. So for instance, here in Chicago, there have been new bike trails that have been accompanied with gentrification. And so it's very important at the beginning that community groups are involved in the planning, in figuring out if there are jobs associated with a new development that local folks have access to them, and to also be thoughtful about protecting affordable housing in the area, in that proximity. I think, again, coming back to Leo's question, how do we move beyond theory? I mean, that's a very specific, practical, and applied answer that we want to be really careful when we think about improving the community, that we're clear about for whom, and making sure that there are protections, so that, again, we don't inadvertently contribute to displacing and relocating people.
I like that. I could have a conversation with you about that for a long time.
Because what is your context?
Well, I live in Kansas City, and we're getting a new light rail system, and we what I specifically see a lot of, we're getting the NFL draft coming, and so they're doing a lot of neighborhood cleanups and improvements, and I work with homeless veterans specifically, and I see them just getting moved out, or they're living in a place now that, you know, they've lived in for 10 years and now their rent is doubling.
Yeah.
And they are forced to do month-to-month leases rather than year-long leases. And it does create a problem. And while I understand we do need that light rail system, definitely in Kansas City, the impact that it's had is significant as well.
Yeah, I have seen that too. And again, it doesn't have to happen. There are policies that can be put in place to try to protect and prevent some of those things from happening. But you have to be thoughtful and planful at the outset in terms of those sorts of consequences, because they do happen. And sometimes I think city leaders are so excited for that beautification and tourist money to come in that they try to downplay those sorts of fears, but they're not unfounded. So I think that's really important. I mean, that's another example. I think sometimes when social workers hear advocacy, they think that means, okay, I have to have my policy memo and go to City Hall or go to Capitol Hill. And that's important. I'm not downplaying that. But what I am also saying is that there are other ways to do advocacy before we get to Capitol Hill that can make really tangible improvements in people's lives, or at least protect them from harm. So I'm glad you shared that example.
And I'm starting, I feel, I don't want to make this all about myself, but I'm starting to dip my toe into this advocacy process as well. And what I'm learning, that it's okay to, I call it like a grassroots project, is to inform my friends and family and my social circle of the impact of things. So at least they can vote, you know, have a little bit more knowledge on voting, or they can spread the word. You know, it's kind of like a rumor. You know, things can spread over and over and over. So I think that's important.
I do too.
If it's okay with Nicole, I'm going to share. She says, everyone deserves. So someone else had said that they live in Kansas City, and she recalled that same controversy. And there was a comment that everyone deserves these things, and sometimes worry as social workers trying to do the right thing that we want to leave communities alone at the risk of causing harm, which means they don't get improved.
I'm sorry, I think I missed the very end of that.
Oh, that's okay. I probably shouldn't have. I think Nicole was just responding to someone else, so I apologize. There is a question that says, what does a policy that prevents displacement look like? Do you have any successful examples of this?
Well, so here in Chicago, for instance, coming back to the bike trail example, there was a moratorium on evictions within proximity of that route for certain years. Again, another example could be to push for something similar to a community benefits agreement, so that you're guaranteeing that some of the benefits associated with light rail or other types of greening that people who live locally are prioritized in terms of having access to those jobs, so that even if the rents do go up, in theory at least, they're also benefiting in terms of income. In other cases, it's best, I think, actually to say, no, such and such project is not a good fit for our neighborhood. Like, not every greening project is inherently good. So I think that there are going to be instances where the right policy is to block something as opposed to pushing for it. But otherwise, I think that in general, the research suggests that like lower scale, smaller scale projects are less impactful when it comes to gentrification. So things more like community-led gardens or community planned smaller parks, as opposed to like the large ones that are really centered towards tourism or rebranding the area. So those are just a few examples. And the other thing that folks can do is you can look me up on Google Scholar or on my faculty page, because I have research on these subjects that could be useful, or they could email me directly and I can send some of the studies we've been working on.
Okay, thank you. I don't see any more questions. So we have about, we have about 15 more minutes. So I'm going to ask you a question, and then I'd like the participants to also think about it. So can you share an experience in your advocacy work that challenged you or that you did not initially know how to respond? Don't tell us what you did just yet. I'm going to ask our participants to think about it for a little bit, and then they can respond on how they would have responded to your challenge. So I'm going to repeat the question. They're asking to repeat the question. It's a question for Dr. Krings. Can you share an experience in your advocacy work that challenged you or that you did not initially know how to respond? But don't tell us the answer yet.
I have a feeling as soon as we end this call, I'll come up with a great example.
Okay.
But what's coming to mind right now, it's not specific, it's general. It comes back to the example I gave where I was in Cincinnati doing organizing to try to change a culture of policing that reduced dependency on arrests and thought about safety differently. Less about surveillance and more about addressing root causes. And that was really hard because there are people that really like arrests and like incarceration, including police that felt like they were being picked on. So I could say that was something that challenged me for 6 years, and we tried to innovate around that topic. I think that topic's become even more prominent. So yeah, what would they do?
Yep. So in the student section, I'll give you a couple minutes to think about it. And then if you have responses, I can add you to the video, or if you just want to put them in the chat box, I can read them out loud. All right, does anybody, I see just one from Michelle that says there needs to be an overhaul of police training. Anybody else have? You stumped us on a good one.
I mean, it's really an unfair answer because, or unfair dilemma, because it's a huge dilemma. It's not just a technical dilemma. Because I think, again, when we think about advocacy, we often think about social workers showing up at the time of a vote. And again, I want to say that is important. We want to register people to vote, and we want to show up at the time of the vote. But what I'm talking about there are more social issues that we also need to think about that happen and in many cases are much bigger and more complicated than a yes or no vote. One thing I can say is that when certain behaviors were written into police officers' job descriptions, where they were promoted or demoted based upon those behaviors, they became way more interested in understanding what it means to work with the community. So I think one, again, probably getting back to Leo's question about shifting from theory into practice, one way that I saw behavioral change happen more was when people understood that you move up or you move back based upon certain behaviors. So I know that's only a piece of the puzzle, but just a practice that I think is worth thinking about.
Julia said having educational opportunities of the negative impacts of arrests could be one solution changing of social norms.
Yeah, that's good.
All right, I have another one. She wants to do it on video. So let me see if I can figure out how to do that. Hopefully, Julia, are you in there?
Hey, how are ya?
Good.
Hi.
Sorry, it's a little unrelated, but it's going back to something I was going to try and ask it earlier, and I kind of missed my opportunity. So environmental justice, and I came into the conversation a little late, so forgive me if I'm repeating. If we've missed the opportunity for the environmental justice advocacy action to take place, blocking the law or creating smaller green spaces, if we miss that opportunity and we come upon this place that's obviously being gentrified, like giant big box stores are going in, and what action step do you recommend at that point?
That's a really tough one because we live in a market economy. And so this is why we really need policy, because once that starts happening, you don't have as many political tools. And what ends up happening is people have to respond as individuals rather than collectives. So in my research, some of the things people do, which is not particularly satisfying, but is the reality of what happens, is that sometimes people start doubling up, or sometimes there'll be individual owners that might keep their rent relatively low, as opposed to like these corporations that own many apartment complexes and then can raise the rents. But once that starts happening, I mean, there are a few things that people do. Is they can relocate, and then there can be efforts by social workers to try to retain ties to that area. So it could be that they're displaced, which is unfortunate, but also part of the pain of displacement. It's not just the economic, it's the relational piece. So sometimes there can be things that happen where like folks come together once a month to like cook out or stay in touch and retain some of those ties. Otherwise, I think sometimes people can organize depending upon the political context. Again, you can organize as a building. You can partner with lawyers to make sure that any sort of evictions are legal. And in some cases, there are legal groups that will take on those sorts of issues with a more collective look as opposed to individual. But ultimately, I mean, the sad reality is I don't have a silver bullet for a capitalist economy because, I mean, we make decisions based on the market. And so when the rents go up, when rents already have gone up, it can be really tricky because, so I mean, that's just the sad reality of things. So I don't know, Julia, if you have more behind that question or if you had like an idea that motivated that question. And I'll be the first to admit I don't find that answer to be particularly satisfying, but I also think it's real. So did you want to
No,
say
it's just
more about that?
I just keep seeing it. I've lived in a lot of cities, and I just saw it happen again. And so it's something where like
Uh-huh.
I've been interested in other areas of social work, so this is becoming something that I'm kind of dropping into more. So I'm learning more around it. So just hearing you speak on that is helpful. So thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. I think gentrification is a type of issue that social workers have not necessarily been at the forefront of as one of our priority issues, even though it has very important impacts on people's health and mental health. And when I say that, I'm speaking about people who are displaced, and I'm speaking about people that stay in the neighborhood but no longer feel like it's their neighborhood, and now they're policed differently or they're surveilled differently. Their safety can shift. So, I mean, I think it's really important. And I have a few papers. There's a paper that Ami Thurber and I wrote called Resisting Gentrification that I could refer you to, where we talk about how, again, the impacts are more than material. They are material, but they're more than that. They're emotional because people have place attachments and community attachments. And so it's important to think about those things too. So, yeah, it's a bad situation. And one that I really feel like if you don't get out in front of, it's really hard to catch up afterward.
Thank you.
Thank you for that question.
We have one more that wants to go live with you, so give me just a second and see.
Yeah, I sure wish I could see everybody, but I appreciate folks bringing their faces on. Hello.
Oh, hi. And hi, Julia. We met in the speed networking. I actually just wanted to add a question to this similar thread. I'm from San Francisco, born and raised, actually 3 generations San Franciscan. And there's an effort of like reparations happening in San Francisco. And so I'm just thinking about, as this conversation is happening, of like, I've met with some of the folks organizing and have participated in, I guess they're like trying to engage as many San Franciscans, whether it's like native or new there, if, different, whether you're in tech or, community organizing or whatever. And I've had conversations. And one of the things that I've asked is like, can you consider, like, don't forget about people who have moved, like when you're building these conversations about reparations, because I'm in Durham, North Carolina, and I had to move out of there, even though my family's been there for 3 generations. And so I'm like, don't forget about people who are no longer there. And like, how do you allow them to come back? And so I'm just wondering like how, like, and of course it's hard because people are like now build lives in other places and are, whatever, but I'm just like wondering if you have any ideas about that, any insight about like that strategy of like having conversations to be like, let's build infrastructure to allow people to actually come back and move back.
Right. That's a great question. Thank you for asking that question. Well, so first, I think that reparations, we do need to think and talk about reparations more as a profession, especially in contexts where Black communities had their land dispossessed either through eminent domain or urban renewal. But I mean, there are public policies that have dispossessed communities of color, and particularly Black communities, of their land. And so it follows in that the state and the federal government have an obligation to make that right. So number one, I'm glad that you brought up reparations. Number two, I can think of a couple examples of places that are attempting that work, and I think they're in process. So I think we need to watch and see how they unfold. But here in Evanston, Illinois, there's been an initiative for predominantly Black families who were pushed out. Now Evanston would be a very expensive place to buy, but they're able to access some money for grants towards down payment assistance to move back if their relatives had been previous owners. And likewise, I've heard the same happening in Portland, Oregon. So the person I mentioned earlier, whose work I think is really instructive on this issue, her name is Ami Thurber. So Thurber. And again, and this goes for anyone, you're welcome to reach out to me if you're not getting this, I'll email you directly. But she's been looking at a similar preference policy in Portland in terms of moving people back. One more thing I'll say, and I realize we're at time, this actually speaks to Julia's issue as well as yours, is one form of social action that I think people can do is point out the absurdity of our housing system. So one specific example of what I mean by that is sometimes in places like Detroit or Cleveland, there can be a large number of vacant homes and large amounts of evictions happening. And so I was thinking of Oakland when you mentioned you were from San Francisco. There was a collective of Black mothers who moved their families in to a vacant home to raise awareness around the absurdity of evictions. So I think that's an example of changing social norms and changing awareness, like why you would push out families to keep a home vacant is absurd. So I think of them, I think it was called Moms for Oakland or something like that, or Moms for Housing Justice.
Yes, I was actually living in Oakland at the time when it happened. Yeah, it was really powerful stuff.
Right, and I think that's how, I think that even that's different than we sometimes think of advocacy in terms of going to the vote, but I think that's important work. So I think.
Thank you so much, Dr. Krings.
No, thank you. Thanks for that's a great question. Thanks for bringing up that topic. Okay, so I think that looks like it's it for us. I seem to be the last person standing. So everybody have a great afternoon and a good rest of your conference, and take care.